Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to Bloomberg Businessweek with Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
Well, last year, women's earnings were 83.6% of men's. This is according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. This is not going to surprise any of you. It's not news to any of you. We know Equal Pay Day. We've been talking about this forever. It's not getting any better. What is talked about less, though, is all of the work that women do that's unpaid. Childcare, taking kids to the doctor, cooking for the family, managing the family budget, taking care of elderly family members, figuring out what the kids are doing for the summer, doing all the work for our show here on Bloomberg Businessweek.
Tim Stenovec.
Please go ahead, Carol.
Tim is actually a really good partner and we share, but in a lot of ways, women are the family safety net. They are holding it together. I have to say there's a story my sister loves to say when she was at home with 3 kids and she and her, my brother-in-law, she and her husband were talking about like insurance and she's like, no, you need more insurance for me because I am the limo driver, I'm the cook, I'm the cleaner. I'm like, she just kind of went through it and it was a really funny conversation, but she was kind of laying out all the jobs she does. And she says, yeah, the insurance you need on me is a lot more than you need on you, honey.
I can see Jessica Calarco just nodding right now. She's sociologist and associate professor at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Her new book is called Holding It Together, How Women Became America's Safety Net. She joins us from Madison, Wisconsin. I got to tell you, we've been talking about this book for a while, and it's great to get to talk to you about it. I just want to start with some numbers here, because your book takes us through a lot of anecdotes of women who you spoke to, who you interviewed, and what they're doing. But we're Bloomberg. We love numbers. We love data. What can you tell us about just how much work women are doing for the American economy?
Sure. So essentially, women are the default caregivers for the children, for the sick, for the elderly, not only for kids, but filling in those kinds of jobs that you mentioned before. And essentially, they are doing this work. This is actually related to the numbers that you mentioned before in terms of, women's the equal pay or the lack of equal pay, in part because the kind of work that women are doing behind the scenes is a big factor in where that gender gap in pay comes from. That the more labor, the more unpaid labor we heap onto women, the harder it is for them to advance in their careers, the harder it is for them to compete with men and in ways that other countries don't. And research shows that one of the strongest predictors of our, economic growth in countries is the amount of money that we invest in providing the kinds of supports that help to alleviate some of those gender gaps in both unpaid work and also the kinds of gender gaps that show up in paid work as well.
Jessica, if the pandemic hadn't happened, would you have written this book?
I don't think so. I certainly this book started as a project I was interested in, what I thought of at the time as the sort of best laid plans of parenting, how you have ideas about the kind of parent that you want to be and life intervenes and life intervened in the sense of a pandemic happened in the middle of my data collection efforts and really pushed me to want to understand that the interviews that we were doing and the surveys we were doing with families across the US at the time really showed how much of an impact the pandemic was having, especially on families with children and especially on the moms within those families who were really trying to hold it together in the midst of this crisis, which led me to want to understand how did we get to this point of relying on women to be the social safety net for us? And then in the context of the failure of Build Back Better, why didn't we learn from the mistakes of the pandemic? Why didn't we pursue those kinds of policies that might have helped to put us on better footing, both gender-wise and in terms of economic parity with other types of countries that have used those social safety nets for decades?
Okay, so the simple question with perhaps not a very simple answer, how did we get here? How did we get to the point where women became America's safety net?
So we can trace this back to, essentially, in the book, I trace this back to the 1930s and to the pushback in the wake of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. Essentially, at the time, the National Association of Manufacturers, a business lobbying agency, was looking for ways to resist some of the higher corporate taxes and higher taxes on wealthy people that were needed to pay for these kinds of strong social safety net programs. And what they found at the time, I talk about in the book, were a group of neoliberal economists out of Austria who were developing this theory that we don't don't actually need social safety nets as a country, because if we don't have protection, people will take steps, make better choices to keep themselves safe from risk. And this theory has been debunked over time in showing that that's not actually how people respond to risk. But they use this to fuel not only changes in policy in the US, but also massive propaganda campaigns, things like General Electric Theater, which helped to create this perception of kind of pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps, this very American mentality, and also reinforced traditional gender roles, which helped to lay the groundwork for the kinds of policy decisions that we made after World War II, for example, of instead of trying to take steps to allow women to stay in the workforce, to continue those Rosie the Riveter jobs that they'd had, we shuttered the child care centers that we put in place during the war, and we pushed women back home and really embraced the 1950s culture around gender. And that echoes of that still exist today in the way that we treat women as a reserve force.
I have to jump in, because here we are 70 years. My grandmother was a Rosie the Riveter. Like, here we are, and she was actually a working woman before and after the war. It was just kind of what they had to do. It was also a time when you had multi-generations in a household, and, you know, older generations took care of the kids, and, but that was kind of my grandparents' household. Having said that, here we are, 70 years later, and we're still talking about the same old problems. Tim, we talk about childcare, the costs, the juggling. Like, why haven't, right?
I mean, I can speak from personal experience. It's just a daily struggle figuring out who's picking up what kid, who's cooking dinner.
And you guys have childcare.
We have childcare, yeah.
So I just feel like, why are we still having these difficult conversations? Why haven't we figured out a better system? Why isn't it? It's not a new thing. Is it policymakers at the federal level? Is it state level? Is it just a society so entrenched that we don't value women as much? What is it?
I mean, essentially, other countries use social safety nets to help people manage these challenges and manage these risks. They use, taxes and regulations to not only protect people from falling into poverty, but to help people manage the challenges of daily living, things like childcare, things like healthcare, and also to ensure, with things like limits on paid work hours, to ensure that people have the time and the energy to do this work of taking care of their families, taking care of their communities, taking care of their homes even. And in the US, we instead try to DIY society. We tell people that they should be able to manage this risk on their own, but the reality is that that's not possible. And that's where women come in the sense that they're tasked with holding it together, with doing the unpaid and underpaid labor that makes it seem like this DIY illusion is possible, even when it's leaving us on the edge of collapse.
There's a lot we want to get to in the remaining minutes we have with you. I want to start, though, by just understanding data collection and how you reported out this book. Just give us an idea of how you were able to gather these stories from so many women.
Sure. So we started by recruiting 250 pregnant women from prenatal clinics in Indiana, and this was in 2018 and 2019. And we were following those same women over time with surveys and in-depth interviews every 6 months from the time that they were pregnant through their first 2 years postpartum. And the pandemic hit in the middle of this, so we did 3 additional waves of surveys and interviews with the mothers and their partners and some of their social network contacts. And then, because this was mostly an Indiana-based sample, we also did 2 national surveys, each with over 2,000 parents from across the US to better understand how to kind of contextualize the findings from our qualitative data. And then I also dug into a lot of the historical research and some media case studies for the book as well to better understand, how did we get here? And then what are some of the myths that are helping to, the cultural myths that are helping to keep us from changing?
Let's go there, because that's where I want to go. Chapter 6, the Mars-Venus myth. I can't tell you how many times we're having conversations and it's like, well, of course, Mars, Venus, we're different. We're wired differently. So of course, women are the caregivers. It's just the way it is. Go there, because I love this.
Sure. So essentially, there's this myth that is perpetuated by many parts of our culture that suggests that men and women are just fundamentally different.
But go to the book, right? The book, 1992.
Exactly. So, it stems in part, certainly these ideas are much older than that, but it's echoed in this kind of John Gray's kind of classic men are from Mars, women are from Venus, which almost, suggests that men and women are from different planets, not only different species even. And it echoes of this. You can hear this in, recent conversations, things like Harrison Butker's commencement speech around this idea that women are just happier at home, that women are, that's their natural duty or their natural responsibility to be in the home. And what research research shows is that belief in these kinds of mythical ideas, and that they are mythical, that gender is way more complicated than this sort of simple pink-blue binary, and that socialization, early exposure, that parents and adult caregivers treat children very differently on the basis of perceived gender from very early on in their lives, and that this lays the groundwork. We expect girls to be mothers from the time that they're old enough to hold a baby doll in ways that we simply don't expect for boys.
But what's interesting is, and I just want to stop for a moment. There was an interview you did, and Tim and I both like reading this, that Mars and Venus, men and women are just fundamentally different, both psychologically, it's an explanation, right? It's also very convenient, you have said in the past. It means, though, we don't need big structural solutions. That's kind of the payoff, right? If we believe that we are fundamentally different, it's not that there's something structurally wrong. And that is maybe why we continue to have this conversation decade after decade.
Exactly. What I find in the national surveys that I've conducted with parents is that the majority of dads, for example, believe that kids are better off with their mothers at home. And what I also find is that the dads who believe in that myth, who believe that it's better for kids to have a mother at home than to have a mother who's engaged in paid work, is that those are also disproportionately the dads who reject the need for a stronger social safety net. And essentially believing this myth, believing that women are just happier at home or that it's better for kids to have mom at home, allows us to feel like, well, maybe we don't need to invest in that stronger social safety net. Maybe we don't need paid parental leave or universal affordable childcare, because it just works better for everyone if mom is at home, as opposed to in the paid workforce.
Where are we right now as we head into the election of 2024? Because I was actually talking with a guest earlier on our crypto show, and she's big in it was a crypto show, so she's big into crypto, and she sent a tweet out earlier this year, Jessica, that talked about choosing between on the ballot women's bodies and the right to have autonomy over your body versus your wallet, because she doesn't believe that the Biden administration is pro crypto enough. And it was interesting to hear that juxtaposition, because, and I asked her, is it actually that black and that white for you? And she said there are a lot of people who are single issue voters when it comes to crypto. But here in 2024, I think we're at a time when a lot of people never thought that Roe v. Wade would actually be overturned. How does the conversation in your world shift in an election year like this?
Yeah, I think we have to think about the way that denying people bodily autonomy, denying reproductive rights, makes it easier to exploit women's labor. It can push them into motherhood in ways that make it difficult for them not only to have choices about things like finishing college or investing in the kinds of careers that they need to take time for, but can also leave them pushed into the kinds of low-wage jobs that offer limited options for their families, that make it harder for them to get ahead. And so I think we have to think about the way that these kinds of attacks on reproductive freedom are attacks also on women's economic opportunities and on their ability to take care of themselves and their families financially as well.
You get into this idea. I don't want to end without thinking about, like, how do we fix this? You talk about a union of care. So we've got about a couple of minutes left. How do we move forward so that in 10 years from now, you and I aren't having this same conversation?
Absolutely. I think we have to, you mentioned before the break, the importance of valuing care work, in the sense that we know that women do twice as much unpaid care work in the US as women. And estimates suggest that unpaid care work done by women is valued at over $600 billion a year. And so I think we can think about the value that women are adding to the economy, even if they're not themselves being compensated for it, and also recognize how that kind of care work benefits all of us. And that if we all had the kinds of policy protections in place, that we could share that unpaid care work more equitably, and also ensure that we have the time and energy to do it sustainably, so that we can, and I'm guilty myself of having a giant pile of clean laundry piled in my bedroom because I just don't have time to put it all away. But with better protections, we might have the time. And that's where a union of care comes in.
I'm waiting for AI to do that, to be quite honest with you. Yeah, Tim and I keep talking. AI is going to be innovative and disruptive when it can do the dishes and do the laundry.
That's what we're looking for.
Run a vacuum. Oh, I've got one of those already.
So then we can actually, I would love it. So then I could actually spend more time with my kids.
Exactly. You know, are you hopeful? Just got about 25 seconds left.
I think I'm hopeful in the sense that if we can come together and reject the kinds of myths that divide us, that we can fight together for the net that we actually need and deserve.
Right. If anything we've learned, I feel like since the pandemic, since George Floyd, stereotypes, myths, like these are things that maybe limit us in thinking differently about the policy that's really needed to solve some of the problems that are out there. Jessica, really enjoyed it. Jessica Clarko, she is sociologist, associate professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Holding It Together, How Women Became America's Safety Net. It is a new book. And really
came out on
enjoyed
June
the
4th,
conversation.
so you can buy it now.
Yeah, really good stuff, and really just kind of an important part of the narrative. Jessica, thank you again. Really appreciate it.